Welcome back, everyone. Tonight's episode is going to be special coverage focused on the policies of President Donald Trump and Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. Now, with the U.S. presidential elections coming up on November 3rd, I thought it'd be helpful to go over the policies of both Trump and Biden. And for this report, I'll be making an effort to present the policies of both candidates as accurately as possible. Now, for this analysis, the Epoch Times put together a full infographic that outlines the policies of both candidates. We looked at their written policies, their public statements, and with President Trump, we also looked at the policies he's already passed. I'll be going through this with a bit of analysis to give as complete a picture as possible of what their policies are. Let's jump into this now. All right, let's start off with the economy. Among Trump's policies are to give tax credits to companies that move manufacturing back to the United States while placing tariffs on companies that don't. He's negotiating and improving trade deals such as USMCA, the China Phase 1 trade deal, and others. For businesses, he's cutting government regulations and red tape and removing caps on the U.S. energy industry to make the United States a net energy exporter. And he's also working on programs to help create jobs, such as by funding on-the-job trainings and apprenticeships and removing requirements that require people to have college degrees to get jobs with the U.S. government. Now, as for Biden, his economic policies include increasing federal minimum wage to $15 an hour and to strengthen unions. With an economic plan modeled on the Green New Deal, he'll also make infrastructure investments focused on reducing carbon emissions. He'll also make a racial equity mandate for the Federal Reserve, which prints our money, and will push for more top-down standards for labor, human rights, and environmental protection in any future U.S. trade agreements. He'll also be banning anonymous shell companies and also create a system that can more carefully monitor cross-border transactions. Now, when we look at it overall, Trump's approach with helping the economy is to make it easier for Americans to find jobs by giving incentives to companies to hire Americans and by making the job market more accessible. He's also working to create more jobs by cutting red tape for businesses and by renegotiating trade deals so that Americans can benefit more from them. Biden's economic policies focus more on advancing progressive issues and creating top-down requirements on progressive issues such as environment and race politics. And so again, Trump really means less regulation, fighting for the American workers. Biden looks at more government regulation on businesses and also fighting more for progressive politics. Now next up, let's look at taxes. Trump has so far signed tax cut legislation which has allegedly saved the average American around $2,000 in taxes each year. He's also looked to cut capital gains tax by 15% and increase the estate tax basic exemption amount from $5 million to $10 million. And he's also proposing a cut to payroll tax. Now for Biden, he will get rid of the Trump tax cuts.
That's why I'm going to eliminate the Trump tax cuts. And I'm going to eliminate those tax cuts and make sure that we invest in the people who, in fact, need the help. People out there need help. But why didn't you?
He'll also greatly increase capital gains tax to the same rate as income tax. And he'll also increase taxes by $4 trillion over the next 10 years, while allegedly also focusing heavily on people who make over $400,000 a year. Now looked at overall, Trump aims to reduce taxes, including for average Americans, in order to reduce their burdens, and to also give more incentive to companies moving jobs back to the United States, which would increase employment, and also increase the number of taxpayers as well, and also create more capital flowing within the U.S. economy. Now, Biden aims to increase taxes overall and to also heavily tax wealthy Americans especially, in order to finance jobs through environmental infrastructure projects. And so again, what does it say? Trump aims to reduce taxes and make U.S. markets more appealing to businesses. The idea is if he opens more businesses, more people come back, that will increase tax revenue in the United States, lower unemployment, and make the U.S. more prosperous, meaning more tax revenue. Biden looks to increase taxes on individuals without doing so. He wants to put more pressure on businesses, make it so they have to pay taxes, make it harder for them to dodge taxes. Now, as for governance overall, Trump's policy is to restore the vertical separation of powers between federal and state governments. He would also build more statues of U.S. historical heroes, promote more classical education on American history. When it comes to politicians directly, he plans to pass congressional term limits, appoint more judges, promote voter ID for elections, and exclude illegal immigrants from the U.S. Census. He also plans to make Puerto Rico the 51st state. Now, as for Biden, he would support removing the Confederate flag and statues of Confederates from public properties. He would also create a new national commission that would look for issues of discrimination and racism in federal government policies, including on income, wealth, education, and health, and also to equality of outcome on employment, and to look for reparations for slavery. He would also oppose voter ID law and instead support easier access by voting through same-day registration, early voting, and universal options to vote by mail. He also supports keeping illegal immigrants included on the U.S. Census, which determines government appointments and redistricting. He would also make the District of Columbia the 51st state. Now, looked at overall, Trump would look to reduce the number of career politicians and make sure the government more directly represents U.S. citizens, while Biden would be focused more on extending government further to illegal immigrants. Trump would push for more security in U.S. elections, while Biden would push for less regulated voting. Trump would also focus more on rekindling patriotism, while Biden would be more focused on sweeping policies for identity and race politics through the federal government. So again, what does this show us? Trump's policies would be on patriotism and restoring what America once was. Biden would focus more on identity and race politics and on moving forward from what is viewed as a negative history of the United States. Now let's move on to healthcare. Trump's policy is to completely repeal the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. This started by him ending the individual mandate, which penalized taxpayers if they didn't sign up for Obamacare. He also supports programs to make medical providers disclose the actual cost of care, ending programs that allow middlemen to negotiate drug rebates. And he's also speeding up the approval process for generic drugs, passed a bill that allows Americans to try experimental drugs and treatments if they face life-threatening illnesses, and has also expanded telehealth through Medicare and allowed small businesses to join together to access insurance plans that are normally only available to large companies. Trump has also curbed federal funding that even indirectly finances abortion. Now, Biden's policies would be to bring back and expand Obamacare, while also introducing a new public health insurance plan run by the federal government, and also expand Medicare in states that reject the expanded Obamacare policies. Now, while expanding socialized health care, Biden will also target healthcare companies with antitrust violations and create government-set prices for new drugs with no competition. He'll also provide free healthcare to illegal immigrants, double federal funding to community health centers, and expand national and global vaccine programs. Biden will also treat abortion as a constitutional right and will restore federal funding to Planned Parenthood. Now, looked at overall, Trump is working to end Obamacare, while Biden wants to expand it and bring in more complete state systems of socialized medicine, and to also extend these programs to illegal immigrants. Trump is also working to cut federal policies and to lower the cost of medicine, while also making it easier to access health care. Biden, on the other hand, looks to cut competition from the private sector while driving up policies that allow for state control of medicine. So what does this show us? Trump's focus is on reducing regulations and using that to reduce the cost of medicine. Biden is looking more for socialist medicine and socialist health care. Now let's move on to education. Trump's policy is for school choice. That means homeschool, vocational school, private school, charter, online learning, and other forms of education. He wants federal funds to follow students. That's around $12,000 a year for each child, which would let them use the money, for example, to attend private schools if they don't want to attend public schools. Trump also opposes Common Core and also supports alternative education programs and less emphasis on testing. Now for colleges, Trump is working to ensure First Amendment protections on free speech for students on campuses, and he's also pushing to sue schools that have discriminated against Asian and white students. Trump would also be restoring private sector loans for colleges in order to decrease the cost for students. Now, as for Biden, he would triple the funding for Title I schools and increase teacher wages, while also doubling the number of social workers at schools and increase federal funding for public school infrastructure. He would also provide universal pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds and double funding for home visiting programs for parents of young kids. Now, for public colleges and universities, he would also make them free for students whose families make less than $125,000 a year. And he would also be forgiving student loan debt for all people in the low and middle income brackets. Now, overall, Trump's policies would reduce state intervention in the school system and give students and parents the ability to use federal funding for private schools or other forms of education if they feel, again, public schools aren't meeting their needs. Now, Biden, on the other hand, would greatly increase state intervention in the school system by adding large amounts of additional funding. Now, for colleges and universities, Trump would aim to make them more affordable by making them use public sector loans, and which would give the colleges and universities incentives to ensure that students could pay them back. While Biden would push for a socialized education model, where current costs of education would be financed by taxpayers, and where the federal government would forgive existing student debt. And so overall, what does this show us? Trump would mean more choice with schools, more private sector competition, and ending government intervention to reduce the cost of education. Biden would mean more centralization with the school system, bigger government school systems, and socialized education when it comes to schools, when it comes to colleges and universities. Now let's move on to border security and immigration. Trump's policies to end the diversity lottery program that randomly gives 50,000 green cards a year, and to also increase merit-based immigration from 12% to 57% or higher. He will also end the program that automatically grants citizenship to children of illegal immigrants, and potentially resubmit a repeal of DACA to the Supreme Court. Trump will also continue to build 733 miles of wall along the southern border. He also work to ensure that Central American countries help with their asylum cases, while also continuing the new system where asylum seekers who enter the United States illegally are sent to wait in Mexico until their cases are reviewed. And in the U.S. as well, he will increase enforcement on companies that employ illegal immigrants, and also punish sanctuary cities that have been protecting them from immigration authorities. Now, Biden, meanwhile, will work on granting citizenship to more than 11 million illegal immigrants in the United States, including those under DACA and temporary protection status. He will also end the construction of the border wall, end travel bans on countries prone to terrorism, reduce the number of ICE enforcement centers, and end workplace enforcement of illegal workers while also promoting them to establish unions. Now, Biden would also be expanding the refugee cap to the United States each year from 18,000 to 125,000 people, while also vastly expanding government resources that are provided for all immigrants, including illegal immigrants. He'll also continue chain migration and provide green cards to foreign graduates from doctoral programs. Now, overall, what does this show us? Trump is aiming for tight border security and enforcement of existing laws on illegal immigration. He'll have a much harder stance on illegal immigration. Biden, on the other hand, while he would have border checkpoints still, would essentially mean open borders, with very little enforcement within the United States on people who enter the country illegally, with large programs giving them money and healthcare and other programs, and with large amount of other taxpayer-funded programs to assist them. Now let's move on to law enforcement and criminal justice. Trump would end no-knock warrants and fully fund and support police departments. He also signed the First Step Act, which released over 3,000 inmates who are mostly in prison on drug and weapons charges. Trump also supports the death penalty. He's pushing for harsher crackdowns on child sex trafficking, as well as on websites that facilitate child sex trafficking and pedophilia. Trump also opposes federal-level decriminalization of marijuana, but has indicated he supports state decisions to legalize it. Now, as for Biden, he aims to decrease funding to police departments while also increasing diversity programs. He would also limit the ability of police to get military surplus equipment and also limit the legal protections for police officers. Biden would also give $20 billion for programs focused on shifting away from incarceration and more towards prevention. He would support the end of mandatory minimum sentences in federal law. He would eliminate the death penalty, end cash bail and private prisons, end all incarceration for drug use, and instead divert people to drug courts and treatment programs. He would also use more clemency powers for some nonviolent and drug crimes. He would also decriminalize marijuana, expunge prior convictions, and provide housing to every person released from prison. So again, what does this show us? Trump's focus is on stronger law enforcement, funding for police, improving policies as well, and also giving more resources for police to better do their jobs. Biden's focus is on defunding police, lightening the enforcement of law, and decriminalizing a lot of things currently designated as crimes. Now let's move on to the Second Amendment and gun control. Trump supports the Second Amendment. He opposes laws that go against high-capacity magazines and bans on rifles. He condemns lawsuits against gun manufacturers. He opposes laws that require registration of ammunition and licensing requirements on law-abiding gun owners. He also repealed a law that would send mental health information on national background checks, but also supports red flag laws. Now, Biden, meanwhile, has a strong stance against the Second Amendment. He would ban the manufacturing and sale of military-style guns and of high-capacity magazines. He would put new regulations on people who currently own what would be designated as assault weapons. He would also restrict purchases of firearms to one per month per person, end all online sales of firearms, ammunition, kits, and gun parts, and begin a system where all guns require the owner's fingerprints to operate, the smart guns. He would also increase the length of background checks from 3 days to 10 days, require background checks for all gun sales, use Social Security data to prohibit people from owning guns for mental health reasons. He would also push for adoption of red flag laws in all 50 states. Now, what does this show us overall? Trump's policies on protecting gun rights, upholding the Second Amendment, protecting the Second Amendment. Biden's policies on heavily reducing gun rights, ending to a large extent protections under the Second Amendment. Both of them do support red flag laws, but Biden wants to make it so it covers all 50 U.S. states. Now let's move on to military. Trump established the Space Force as the sixth branch of the U.S. military. He pushed forward with programs for the readiness of U.S. troops. He's pushing to bring troops home, passed acts to help veterans get better care through the VA. He also launched programs to dismantle the ISIS terrorist organization, did programs to kill the Iranian terrorist, Major General Qasem Soleimani, and also ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And he also pushed for the dismantling of North Korea's nuclear weapons program and is building a stronger system for cyber defense and for missile defense. Now, Biden supports funding the U.S. military and also for modernization, but would like to decrease federal spending on the U.S. military overall. He'd also make climate change the core policy and plan of the Department of Defense and also allow transgender troops. He would only use military force to defend vital U.S. interests and with alleged informed consent from Americans. He would also end wars in the Middle East and bring U.S. troops home, as Trump is also, and end support for Saudi Arabia in its conflict in Yemen, something Trump supports, and also close the Guantanamo Bay facility. Now again, what does this show us? Trump's policy is strong military, quick actions to respond to threats, strengthening the U.S. military, strengthening readiness. Biden's focus on the military is more making it so it functions on climate change. Now let's move on to foreign affairs. Trump has pulled the United States out of several international deals that he deemed were not in U.S. interest. He's also pushed for renegotiating them on stronger terms. These include the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, others as well. Trump has also pushed the United States out of United Nations programs that he deemed were not independent or were serving ulterior motives, such as the UN Human Rights Council, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, World Health Organization, and the International Criminal Court. He has also increased sanctions on Iran, Russia, and China, helped establish peace agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and with other countries to come. He also expanded cooperation with Taiwan and Poland and pushed NATO countries to contribute more. Now, as for Biden, he would have the United States rejoin many of the agreements that Trump pulled the U.S. out of, including the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran deal if Iran is in compliance, and many of the UN councils and programs. Biden would also expand U.S. international aid and commit to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. He's also calling for commitment to NATO. He'd also push to engage with China, North Korea, and Russia for denuclearization, something Trump is also doing as well. Now, what does this show us overall? Trump's focus is on facilitating new agreements more in U.S. interest and also establishing new alliance while pulling the U.S. out of agreements that do not serve its interests. Biden is more heavily pushing for the United Nations and NATO programs. And last but not least, let's move on to China policy. Trump has completed the Phase 1 trade deal, put sanctions on many Chinese companies, crippled the CCP's high-tech plans through chip bans, put bans on TikTok and WeChat over national security concerns with other companies on the horizon. He cracked down on Chinese agents and people involved in CCP programs to steal U.S. innovation, sanctioned Chinese officials and companies involved in human rights abuses, and has overall taken a very strong stance against the Chinese Communist Party. Now, Biden's policy would be to establish bilateral agreements with China on climate change policies. He'd also push the CCP to reduce its carbon footprint in its Belt and Road Initiative when the CCP goes and makes trade deals with the countries. He would also encourage tech companies to pledge to not facilitate human rights abuses in China. So what does it show us about policy? Trump has a strong stance on China. His policy is a strong stance standing up to the Chinese Communist Party with a push to end its subversive activities. Biden's focus is a lighter stance on China, with a focus heavily on climate change policy. Now folks, this episode has gone quite long, so we'll have the full version of it up on Patreon for our Patreon supporters, and also on the Epoch Times website for Epoch Times subscribers. If you want to watch the full version, please check it out on either one of those platforms. With that said, folks, again, we're broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Also, if you want to support us, please again join us on Patreon. You can find the link to it in the description below. If you can, also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel. If you want to go the extra mile, please tell your friend or family member about Crossroads. Now, that said, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.